There were indeed many famines in India prior to British rule. However, the British administration did implement some important famine relief measures and policies in India, such as developing irrigation projects to improve food production and prevent drought, establishing a famine commission to study famine causes and response, creating famine codes to guide famine relief efforts, setting up famine relief funds and importing food during shortages, building railways to transport food more efficiently, removing restrictions on trade and movement of grains between provinces. While these measures were not always successful or sufficient, and major famines did occur under British rule as well, the beginnings of an organized famine response system in India can be attributed to British policies. Indian leaders continued and built upon these systems after independence. However, the root causes of famine in India were complex, including poverty, population pressures, taxation, agricultural policies, and natural factors like drought. Responsibility for famines cannot be simplistically ascribed. We need nuanced analysis of British rule as well as Indian conditions. Many historians argue that certain British policies exacerbated food shortages during famines. There is ongoing debate about this complex period of history. In 1770, a significant famine took place in the Bengal region that caused widespread starvation and death. The famine was caused by a combination of factors including crop failures, high taxes imposed by the British East India Company, and inadequate famine relief measures. There are no definitive historical records on the exact death toll, but estimates range from 2 to 10 million out of Bengal's estimated population of 30 million at that time. The famine had a devastating impact and led to the depopulation of many regions in Bengal. Contemporary observers like Warren Hastings estimated that about a third of the population in the affected regions died due to the famine. Pre-famine population estimates of Bengal range between 20 to 30 million, while post-famine estimates drop to around 10 million, indicating massive casualty. The famine affected mainly the modern-day states of West Bengal, Bangladesh, and parts of Orissa, Bihar and Jharkhand. One major cause was a severe drought in 1769 that caused crop failures and left the region devoid of food. The drought was accompanied by outbreaks of disease like malaria, smallpox and cholera that took many lives. The monsoon rains failed in 1769, leading to drying up of rivers and devastation of agriculture. The winter crops were damaged by a lack of rain and low soil moisture. The summer crops were ravaged by a severe drought in 1770 that left the soil parched. Food grain prices shot up, leaving the poor unable to afford supplies, leading to starvation. Contemporary reports describe corpses littering roads, mass graves, and deprivation across the Bengal countryside. The British East India Company's exploitative economic policies exacerbated the famine conditions in Bengal. The company imposed oppressive taxes on land, crops and commodities which depleted peasant incomes. Taxes continued to be harshly collected even during the peak famine, resulting in inability to afford food. The diversion of food crops like rice for opium production reduced available food supplies. Restrictions imposed on internal trade and movement of food grains between regions worsened shortages. Hoarding and profiteering by merchant middlemen was rampant, leading to soaring prices. The Nawab's government and local landlords failed to provide adequate famine relief. The mortality was especially high among the poor peasants, laborers and artisans. Contemporary observer William Bolts estimated about 2.5 million deaths in Bengal province alone. The Bengal famine had long-term economic and social impacts on the region. There was a shift away from cash crops to food crops in the aftermath. The revenue collection system was reformed after the famine. The Bengal economy took decades to recover from the devastation. The demographic balance shifted with migration and depopulation of the worst affected areas. The famine sparked bitterness and anti-company sentiments among the Bengalis. The changing land ownership patterns after the famine favored the zamindars over the peasants. Food shortages and epidemics recurred in Bengal over the next 50 years, indicating the prolonged after effects. The Crown took over the administration of India from the East India Company after the famine. Scholars argue the Bengal famine led the British to pay greater attention to agriculture and irrigation. The Crown set up a famine commission to study causes and responses to food shortages. Irrigation projects were undertaken on a large scale after the 1770 famine. Railways were built to transport food grains more efficiently within India. The telegraph was introduced to communicate warnings about food shortages faster. Reservoirs, canals, and other public works projects were built to prevent droughts and famines. The famine codes were created to guide provincial administrators on famine prevention and relief. Relief camps, doles, and public works were set up to provide food and employ the poor. Grain imports from other provinces were arranged and distributed to the affected regions. The import of food grains from overseas was used to stabilize prices during scarcities. Scholarship on the Bengal famine emerged in the late 19th century by historians like Ramesh Chunder Dutt. Detailed official reports like Annals of the Indian Administration by Meadows Taylor provided data about the famine. Scholars have debated the degree of responsibility of different factors like drought versus British policies. Novelists like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay created Bengali literary works based on the famine. The Bengal famine entered folklore and collective memory through ballads, plays, and artistic works. Comparisons have been made between the 1770 famine and the Bengal famine of 1943 by scholars. The scale of the 1770 famine is contested by some historians as lower than the 1943 famine. Estimates range from 2 million to over 10 million deaths, indicating the challenges in determining accurate figures. Skeletal remains and archaeological evidence attest to mass mortality and ephemerality of life. Scholars highlight a cycle of famines in Bengal during 1760s-1770s, pointing to wider economic causes. The drought and resultant crop failures triggered the wider famine conditions as a natural cause. The La Nina weather phenomenon may have played a role in the weak monsoons and drought. The East India Company policies exacerbated the conditions during the famine and relief period. The Nawab's policies like taxation possibly aggravated the crisis, though the company had greater responsibility. Complex interplay of environmental and economic factors combined to produce the tragedy. Impact was felt on language and literature with descriptions of mass starvation and deaths. The Bengal famine entered historical memory and became a reference point for later disasters. It highlighted the urgency of famine prevention and relief measures for the colonial government. The Crown appointed Cornwallis as Governor General after the famine to reform land revenue policies. Zamindars and merchants were blamed by scholars for profiteering during the crisis at the expense of peasants. Forecasters today draw parallels between droughts due to El Niño and 18th century Indian famines. The Bengal famine showed the need for studying weather patterns to predict harvests. Records are patchy, but regional officials' reports indicate episodic starvation even in 1771-1773. Mortality was higher among marginalized groups like landless laborers and the elderly. Depopulation greatly reduced the agricultural workforce and labor availability in subsequent years. Wild animals from forests are reported to have scavenged on human remains during the famine. Contemporaries felt the famine matched the scale of the plague of Justinian in medieval times. Aftershocks of the event continued with cholera outbreaks and food shortages in the 1780s. The disruption of family structures and social networks had a long-lasting impact. Later famines in British India like the 1876-1878 famine were compared to the 1770 catastrophe. The Crown sought to avoid another reputational disaster like 1770 during the Victorian era. The Bengal famine became a symbol of the suffering caused by company misrule in India. Revisionist histories argue a high mortality in 1770 but question the over 10 million deaths figure. Accurate death toll estimates are impossible given the limited records and data from that period. Assessing the total population of Bengal in 1770 is also problematic for scholars. The massive impact of the famine is, however, borne out by multiple contemporary accounts. Climatic factors were the trigger, but British policies were the proximal cause according to most modern analyses. List of famines in India before the British. Maharashtra drought period ending in famine during 1591-1594. Karnataka famine 1603. Andhra Pradesh famine 1605. Deccan famine of 1630-31. Great famine of 1630-31. Gujarat famine massacre 1630-1773. Widespread epidemics of cholera and smallpox 1636-73. Deccan famine of 1691-1692. Dearth conditions in Hyderabad 1699. Bihar famine 1685. Maratha famine of 1696-1697. Mewar Dobedi disaster 1700s. Localized famine in Indore Hyderabad 1718. Tirunelveli famine 1717. Bengal famine of 1732. Travancore famine 1736. Davao famine 1734. Berar famine 1743-44. Rajasthan famine 1750. Madurai famine 1753. Kanara famine 1754-55. Konkan region famine 1760. Malabar famine 1764. Deccan famine of 1770. Great Bengal famine of 1770-1773. North Arcot famine 1781-82. The Tamil Nadu famine of 1786-88. Gujarat famine 1790. Malabar famine of 1790-92. Deccan famine of 1791-1792. Hyderabad famine of 1799-1800. The Karnataka famine of 1802-1804. Deccan famine of 1802-03. Madras famine of 1803-1804. The Saurashtra famine 1803-05. Gujarat famine of 1810-12. Bombay Presidency famine 1876-78. Great famine of 1783-84. Northwest Provinces famine 1837-38. Bengal and Orissa famine of 1837-42. The Madras famine of 1833. Punjab Hills famine 1836. Bengal famine of 1866-68. Rajputana famine 1863-65. Central India famine 1868. Chota Nagpur famine 1866-67. Bombay Presidency famine 1876-78. Bihar and Bengal famine 1873-74. Great famine of 1877-78. Unfortunately, due to lack of written records for many localities, these famines are often not well documented or understood.